Hello everyone. As the title suggests, today I will be responding to comments from the first chapter of the Alternative Hypothesis Debunked series. I won't be responding to every sentence of critique, as much of the substantive portions of these individuals' comments was already addressed in my videos, which they seem to have not watched before actually commenting. Further, I'm skipping over any redundant or superfluous comments or portions of comments to save time and energy. That said, I've included every substantive comment I received, or tried to, so if you feel I've missed anything, or if you feel I've failed to address any point, please notify me and I'll rectify the issue immediately. Oh, by the way, hi, it's been over half a year since I've made a video. I finished school, landed a job, and finally feel that I again have the time for this channel. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now, let's get to it. Okay, so let's quickly review the allegations that are generally levied against me when it concerns my videos and my arguments and assertions. The first is that I'm denying evolution affects humans. The second, I'm denying phenotypic variation exists. And third, I'm denying that we can categorize based on this phenotypic variation. The first two allegations are ridiculous, I know. I could simply pull a clip or two from the first chapter that shows I'm not denying either one, but I thought it would be better if I just said here that I fully accept the theory of evolution and believe that evolutionary processes are affecting humans, and that today that process is happening faster to humans than at any other time in our history. Also, yes, I recognize that phenotypic variation exists. I'm not colorblind. The final allegation, however, I feel is the crux of the misunderstanding between race realists and myself. This was the whole point of the first chapter, and so I'm shocked that so many felt it wasn't addressed. The claim that I was making in the first chapter is simply that the categorizations that we are making are based on superficial and trivial variations, and that these variations themselves are paired with social and cultural perspectives, beliefs and assumptions about character and quality, which are inaccurate, unreliable, and often based in racism, xenophobia, or religious dogma. What we're going to do here then is discuss definitions of race, consider where it fits taxonomically. Then we're going to discuss some of the perceived differences between blacks and whites, and I don't mean to pick on blacks or whites. It's just that that's generally where the conversation revolves around most commonly, so I want to address it where the most people will find that they have at least an inkling of an understanding of the topics and the conversations surrounding them. And finally, we're going to discuss the reliability of using race as a taxonomic rank in humans and what applying that term means in terms of how accurately it represents reality. So we'll be going over some examples of that here shortly. By the end of this discussion, you'll see, hopefully, why categorists such as myself are unconvinced by the arguments presented by race realists and by the race is a social construct proponents. And hopefully it will clarify the intents and arguments of the first chapter of the Alternative Hypothesis Debunked. We begin by discussing the definition of race in taxonomic terms. Historically, in the days of Darwin, race was synonymous with species. Clearly, under this definition, race doesn't exist. I do concede, however, that most race realists don't assert this definition, and it's not the one I'm arguing against ultimately. Over time, race was reconceptualized as to be synonymous with subspecies, but again, anthropological evidence definitively showed that this conceptualization of race, applied to populations of extant humans, was deeply flawed and unsupported. in part because the variation in humans is far too meager by itself to support such classifications, but also because we uncovered, literally, fossilized specimens which exhibit far more differentiation than modern populations, and which could qualify as subspecies of the Homo sapiens line, with ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, being the other subspecies. Meet your cousin, Homo sapiens idaltu. Currently, most race realists and social construction advocates conceive of race as being an informal taxonomic rank below the level of subspecies. Still, as part of this classification, there is the assumption that distinguishing adaptive differences have accumulated, which constitute identifiable characteristics by which races can be defined. It is my assertion that this is simply not the case, and in the next section we will visit a handful of perceived differences and show them to be nothing but exaggerations and gross distortions. Now that we've considered race as an informal taxonomic rank, let's visit some of the perceived differences between blacks and whites and contemplate the significance of these so-called differences. Again, I'm not trying to pick on blacks or whites, this is just where the majority of the conversation seems to be centered. My detractors bring up a long list of assumed differences to cover, and since this video could easily turn into a mini documentary, I'm only going to address what I consider to be the most significant perceived differences. Therefore, in this next section, I will be first discussing skulls of people and how relevant skulls are in identifying the race of individuals. And I'm going to show why skulls just by themselves are not a good indicator of a race. Next, I'm going to discuss, in a broader sense, genes and variation to show how remarkably similar we are, genetically speaking, while also showing that the diversity that is exhibited across the planet cannot be classified into discrete races. Now, I understand that some in the comment section say, well, we're not arguing for discrete races. I find this to be a disingenuous argument, simply because even if you aren't arguing that there are literal lines in the sand where one race ends and the other begins, you are still arguing that groups of individuals largely will exhibit certain characteristics as opposed to others. So regardless of whether you're arguing for the line in the sand separating peoples, you're still arguing ultimately the same thing. Finally, I'm going to look at physical performance. And this is the most contentious and confusing part of this entire discussion, because nobody has enough information to come to any conclusions, and that's basically what I'll be touching on. I'll also, before I leave this part of the video, be discussing race and IQ and race and behavior very broadly, and touching on some of the main points that I will be covering in the Alternative Hypothesis Debunked Chapter 2, which is still being worked on. I've had to do a couple restarts, which is why it has taken so long, besides the fact that I was very busy with school and life. So, let's jump into it. Firstly, let's talk about skulls. Generally, there are two facets, pardon my pun, of this discussion that are raised most commonly. The first is skull size and shape, and the second is racial identification by forensic anthropologists. Differences in skull size and shape between races have been theorized and measured for hundreds of years, since the days of Samuel Morton in the 1800s to today's disreputable scientific racist J. Philippe Rushton, who passed away in 2012, but not before publishing a series of highly contentious and disinformative papers on the topic. While variations in skull size and mild variations in shape do exist, there is no evidence which suggests that these differences have anything to do with variation in IQ, but rather that they have to do with increased size of eyes, eye sockets, lateral ventricles, and the visual cortex in northern and southern populations, which exist far from the equator. Eskimos have the largest skulls, while Africans have, on average, a larger orbitofrontal cortex than other populations. And this is the only difference that might have anything to do with intelligence. So according to the logic of race realists, Africans should be smarter than Europeans or Eskimos or anybody else. I'll include some sources in the description for further reading. Secondly, there is the assertion by race realists that skulls can and do denote race, but both forensic anthropologists and anthropologists in general reject race as an appropriate or effective representation of human biological diversity. As an example, I'd like to draw your attention to an article written by Konigsberg et al. In 2009 and published in the American Journal of Anthropology, entitled Estimation and Evidence in Forensic Anthropology, Sex and Race, which highlights the importance of informative priors in the identification of skulls. A man in Iowa had his skull analyzed with no informative priors, and was clearly classified as being of Easter Islander descent. However, when they did include informative priors, it turned out that he was clearly classified as American white. Because of the variation in human skulls from around the planet, it can be difficult to identify an individual's race without a large margin of error. Again, I'll include sources in the description. Now we're going to discuss skin color and genetic variation in our species. To start, skin color is an extremely superficial characteristic determined by the size, number, placement of melanocytes, and proportion of pigment types produced by the melanocytes in the skin. Darker skin is the result of adaptation over time to proximity to the equator and exposure to the sun. I've heard people raise the fact that different groups of people have been relatively isolated for 50 to 70,000 years, and then point out the variation in skin tones as if this variation is a result of that relative isolation. In truth, 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, Europeans were decidedly darker than many people living in the Middle East today. Just like the variation in skull size and shape discussed before, these differences are not the result of distinct genetics, but are adaptations that occur rapidly in populations. If we had another hypothetical Earth with people only in Africa, and they again migrated north into what would be Europe, they'd again develop lighter skin, as those genetic variants still exist in these populations. Yes, even eye color variants and hair color variants, etc., would likely reappear rapidly because of natural selection and adaptation to the darker, colder environment. Genetic variation and phenotypic variation in humans is messy, with traits represented everywhere in the world because of the low level of overall genetic variance, and also because of the fact that our entire history has been punctuated by instances of admixture of relatively isolated groups and clinal diffusion, which has been constant and significant, to the extent that virtually nobody could be considered racially pure, even if we wanted to make up such categorizations. In the last several hundred years, our advances in transportation and communication technologies have also done much to expedite both of these processes, as I've touched on in the first chapter of the alternative hypothesis Debunked. As I also mentioned, when we use appropriate measures of variation, such as AMOVA tests, we find an extremely low level of variation in humans, even in the most isolated populations. I used the example of chimpanzees in the first videos, but I don't think it really drove home the point I was making. So here I'm going to use a more striking example, cheetahs. Specifically, we'll be looking at Namibian cheetahs. When AMOVA fixation index scores were generated, it was shown that these cheetahs, all in Namibia, had an fixation index score of 0.021 or 2.1%. Compare that to the global human fixation index value of 0.043 or 4.3%, and factor in the irregular and mixed distribution of genetic variation, and this, combined with the consideration of the structure of our phylogenetic construct and the continued and advancing admixture of populations is why race is not considered a biological reality. I fervently believe that the alternative hypothesis and other race realist communicators are literally capitalizing on the layman's confusion about ethnicity, ancestry, and race, and so I will include several sources which discuss this confusion in the video description. It occurs to me that many race realists conflate any variation at all with evidence of race, and so I hope that now I've finally answered this confusion. Moving on. Let's wrap up the conversation by exploring physical performance in populations and the links to culture, environment, and genetics. The literature clearly shows that 30 to 80% of athletic performance is determined by genes, but it must be said that the sheer number of genes involved means one cannot predict the performance of individuals based on the presence of even several genes associated with high performance in individuals. Just as important are other influences such as culture, training and dedication, and the environment one is raised in and performs in. At this point, it is unlikely that variation in performance among populations isn't at least influenced partly by genetic variation. But because of the complexity and the number of variables involved, no reputable professional would or could claim that differences in performance across a variety of sports or athletic activities between or among populations is due to genes alone, or even mostly. Also, pivotal to this discussion is an acknowledgement of the fact that when discussing peak performance of individuals within and among populations, we're neglecting to consider averages and the profound similarity of athletic performance of populations around the globe. Elite athletes are not representative of populations, obviously, and we should take care not to conflate elites' athletic abilities with general trends in populations. We're vastly more similar than different, of course. I'll close this topic by saying that, just like any other genetic trait, these variants exist globally, only occurring more frequently in populations due to adaptation to local conditions and environment, and in some instances due to historical trends and happenstance. And therefore, we shouldn't forget that these distributions of traits are not distinguishing characteristics, but the emergent properties of our DNA. I'll conclude this entire section before moving on to my segue to race and IQ by again reiterating the point that genetic variation in humans is extremely low, that because of the messiness and irregular distribution of genetic variants and long history of admixture and diffusion within our species, race is at best a social categorization which is inconsistent, inaccurate, and constantly changing, and is therefore not a biological reality. And that the confusion many people share on this topic is due to the deliberate misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda of racists, which is dependent upon the confusion among the average person concerning what qualifies as ethnicity, ancestry, and race. I'm not going to say much here about race and IQ, as I want to reserve most of my material for when I continue the Alternative Hypothesis Debunked series, but I felt that it would be pertinent to at least hint at what I have in store for my subscribers. I think that even if IQ definitively varied among populations for genetic reasons, that this still wouldn't support the justification for the use of race in describing humanity's genetic variation. I don't think that the differences that do exist would be sufficient for declaring a taxonomic rank at the level of subspecies, as many race realists propose, even if it were provably due to genetics. I hold this opinion because I feel that too much emphasis is placed on IQ as a measure of humans. I've already discussed in my video on race and IQ my concerns and objections to assuming IQ data is accurate and representative of the variation in human intelligence. The collected data and interpretations of it are provably compromised by human interpretive error and application misconduct. And beyond these concerns, IQ tests don't answer why a person might score as they do, just that they do. In the next chapter of the Alternative Hypothesis Debunked, I will be exploring the biases of race realists in the interpretation of data and the sources of such data they choose to present. I'll also be discussing why the variance in IQ between populations is statistically unlikely to be associated with genetic variance. And I'll also be discussing the growing body of data and knowledge which directly contradicts the race realist position, and also rules it out as a realistic explanation for the variation we see. All of this, and much, much more, to come shortly. Stay tuned.